Hello, my name is Sarah Brownell, and I'm the moderator of the full scientific session, Evidence for Reducing Perceived Conflict Between Science and Religion. Thank you for joining us. This presentation is one of 3 pre-recorded videos focusing on a speaker's material before all the panelists come together in February during the live discussion. In this video, Elizabeth Barnes will be discussing a study looking at the impact of using religious cultural competence in evolution education on student acceptance of evolution. Later on in this video, Dr. Barnes and I will further delve into the material. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here watching my video today. As Sarah said, my name is Liz Barnes. I'm an assistant professor in the biology department at Middle Tennessee State University, and I run the Social Perceptions of Science lab. And in this lab, we ask the question, what causes rejection of scientifically valid information? So when the science is clear on whether climate change is occurring or whether species evolve, the safety and effectiveness of vaccines and masks, what causes people to reject that information? So I just want you to take just a second to prime you for this talk to think about what your answers are to this question. You can take just a second to pause the video if you need it. Okay, so there are a lot of different reasons that people reject scientifically valid information, but we're going to focus on one today that has garnered a lot of attention in the literature lately, and that's social identity. So social identity can enhance or hinder acceptance of well-established scientific concepts. So for instance, political identity has been shown to be one of the most predictive factors for whether someone accepts anthropogenic climate change and whether they think masks and COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective. And religious identity is also one of the most predictive factors for vaccine hesitancy, climate change denial, and even rejection of evolution. And that's what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today. Because this topic is one that me and other researchers have thought a lot about, because it's a really useful case study on how valid scientific information can be rejected over long periods of time. So evolution is considered a core concept in biology. Some people say it's the foundation of the entire discipline. And yet, according to public polls, about half of the United States doesn't accept human evolution. And this rate has remained relatively stable for at least 30 years since we've been doing these polls. But we know it's been controversial since The Origin of Species was first published more than 150 years ago. And modernly, among undergraduate biology students, 35% of them don't think that life shares a common ancestor. So this would really be sort of like physics introductory college students not accepting gravity. And research shows that this is mainly due to a perceived conflict between religious beliefs and evolution. So consider this graph, which illustrates this impact of identity on the relationship between understanding a scientific concept and accepting it. So on the x-axis here, you have the number of knowledge items that somebody answers correctly on like an evolution test, right? Whereas on the y-axis, you have how likely they are to actually think evolution is true, right? And when you look at the orange line, you see what we would usually expect in science education with a robust scientific concept. As somebody understands this concept more, they're much more likely to think that it's true. So if these below average religiosity students, which religiosity just means the strength of somebody's religious identity, these students, if they get all of the evolution knowledge items correct, they're about 100% likely to think that evolution is true. Whereas with students with that whitish line that are above average religiosity, we see a different relationship. So even if these students fully understand evolution, get 100% on the evolution test, they're only about half as likely to think that evolution is true. And researchers sometimes call this identity protective cognition. We see the same pattern with other sciences and identities. So for instance, political identity is associated with identity protective cognition with climate change and COVID-19 acceptance. So one way that we can counteract identity protective cognition is to reduce the perceived conflict that exists between the identity and the science concept. And one method we can use to do this is religious cultural competence. So this is a potentially effective way for scientists who are mostly secular to teach students who are mostly religious about this topic, evolution, in which religious identity is so important. And this can help bridge this cultural divide. So how do we actually do that though? So now I want to show you a study in which we evaluated instructor strategies for increasing acceptance of evolution that were related to student religious identity. So we recruited college instructors who were teaching evolution and surveyed students before, and after their evolution instruction. So today I'm going to show you results from the survey about students' change and acceptance of human evolution over the semester. We had over 7,000 students in our sample across about 71 classes, and we controlled for students' pre-instruction levels of acceptance in linear mixed models while predicting students' evolution acceptance at the end of the semester. We also included as predictors what students reported the instructors were doing related to reducing conflict among religious students. And I'm going to go through each of these practices in more detail on the following slide. But finally, we included interactions with religiosity in our mixed effect models to see when these practices impacted religious students specifically. Okay, so now going into these instructional practices that we measured. So the first practice that we measured was a scale for which students reported whether the instructor was providing examples of religious scientists or leaders who accept evolution. So for example, one item read, the instructor helped me realize there are scientists who accept evolution and also religious. And students answered on a scale from 1, down at the bottom of that graph that you see, strongly disagree, to 6, strongly agree. And these are student ratings of whether the instructor was discussing examples of religious scientist role models across classes that had more than 50 students. And what you can see is that students' average agreement in these classes varied quite a bit. And the dotted line represents the mean of the data as the whole. And for this practice, the mean was in the middle of the scale. So this indicated that students did not really agree that instructors were providing examples of religious scientist role models. Now, the second scale consists of 3 items and measures how much a student feels they've been given autonomy over their own decision to accept or not accept evolution. So for instance, we have one item that read, I felt like the instructor wasn't trying to force me to accept evolution. And we also see variation across courses here, but the mean rating was higher, so indicating that on average, students agree that instructors encourage them to have autonomy over their decision to accept evolution, but they didn't strongly agree most of the time. And the third scale was a scale that measured negative practices. So practices that could be considered non-culturally competent. And these were capturing some of the practices we had seen secular instructors using in our prior studies. So for instance, one item read, I felt like the instructor thought that religious ideas are not valuable. Now, we were happy to see that the average religion negativity was quite low among this population, with students overall disagreeing that instructors were negative about religion. However, we did see variation across classes, with some being perceived as more negative about religion than others. But did these differences actually predict students' evolution acceptance after instruction? Well, we found that it did. And the strongest effect that we saw was with religion negativity. So in this graph, we have religion negativity on the x-axis with higher numbers representing students who agreed more that religion negativity was happening from the instructor. While on the y-axis, we have how much the student accepted evolution after they had evolution instruction. And we found that when students perceived more religion negativity from the instructor during evolution instruction, that they agreed less with evolution at the end of their evolution instruction. So what about decision autonomy? So in this graph, we now have decision autonomy, or how much the student thought that the instructor gave them freedom to make their own choice about accepting evolution, rather than forcing them to accept evolution. And we saw a small positive effect of this instruction on evolution acceptance after they learned about it. So if instructors present accepting evolution in a way that does not feel forceful, this could help acceptance. And this is really in line with self-determination theory from psychology that says there are 3 key support areas for human motivation. And one of those happens to be how much autonomy they feel that they have over their decisions. And we also found that one instructional practice besides this was particularly impactful for religious students specifically. So this graph looks a little different from the others that you saw because it shows the significant interaction between religious role models and student religiosity. So in this graph, the x-axis represents the extent to which the student perceived that an instructor was giving examples of religious role models who accept evolution. So the lower numbers are for students who agreed less that role models were being presented to them. So since the interaction for religiosity was significant in this model, we overlaid an OLS regression line, or regression lines, for students with low, average, and high religiosity scores. And we found that for students of average and high religiosity, the more they perceived role models presented in their class, the more that they accepted evolution at the end of instruction. And this also reflects self-determination theory, in which belonging is one of those three key factors for human motivation. Okay, so to summarize our findings for this, first, we found that more negativity about religion likely leads to less gains in evolution acceptance. And making students feel as if they have a choice and are not being forced to accept evolution can lead to more gains in acceptance of evolution. And finally, providing examples of religious role models who accept evolution can be particularly impactful for religious students. And really, these results were not surprising to me at all, because our prior work had already indicated that both religious and non-religious college biology students, they do have this stereotype that people have to be an atheist in order to accept evolution. So in fact, when we gave students the option to choose if evolution was atheistic or agnostic, half of them said that evolution claimed there was no God involved in evolution. However, this, of course, only was associated with highly religious students' acceptance of evolution. So for students who didn't have this strong religious identity, whether they thought evolution was atheistic was inconsequential. So having these role models that help break that stereotype could help students have a more accurate picture of evolution. And this is one reason I really wanted to take the time to show the audience some examples of religious scientists who accept evolution, to try to break the stereotype that might lower the sense of belonging people of faith might feel within evolutionary biology. So for instance, Joseph Graves, who is also a speaker in this session, so if you watch his video, you'll learn more about him and his work there. He was the first African-American evolutionary biologist, also happens to be a AAAS fellow. Francis Collins, who just until recently was the director of the National Institutes of Health, is also the founder of an organization called BioLogos, in which their aim is to help reconcile evolution and religion among evangelical Christians, because he himself identifies as an evangelical Christian. Fatima Jackson is a professor of anthropology who is a Muslim studying human evolution. And finally, we can even look to examples from the history of science. So for instance, Theodosius Dobzhansky, he was a really important figure and pioneer in the evolutionary synthesis with genetics, right? And he coined this really famous phrase that a lot of biologists have heard, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. But it was in that same essay, a lot of people don't know, that he also talked about his own religious faith and how religion and evolution do not have to be in conflict with one another. Okay, so I also want to talk about how these role models, it's looking like in the current literature that they may also help improve attitudes towards other scientific concepts that are socially controversial. So for instance, recent literature is showing that messages from Republican leaders showing climate change concern actually increases climate change acceptance among these individuals, and that this is more effective than presenting facts about climate change or even showing the scientific consensus on climate change. And another study that was just published this year showed that messages from Dr. Francis Collins, who I presented to you before, actually helped increase intent to vaccinate among people of religious faith. Okay, so that's all I have, but I wanted to leave you with my take homes that, first, taking into account religious and political identity is important for attitudes towards science, and that by reducing perceived conflict between religion and science, we can help avoid rejection of science more often. And finally, that studies in evolution education and religious cultural competence can serve as a framework for exploring how to reduce conflict with other important topics in biology that are socially controversial in society. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Liz, for that super interesting presentation. Now we're going to have a discussion about some of what you just presented. So I'm pretty familiar with this work because we've worked collaboratively on some of it. But can you tell a little bit more to the audience about how we landed on this framework for teaching evolution, this culturally competent framework?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So I think, one of the first things that you and I noticed when we started doing this work was the disconnect in religious backgrounds and beliefs of scientists who were teaching evolution and the religious students they were teaching evolution to. So we looked into the research literature and we found that only about 25% of biologists say that they believe in God, right? Whereas about 90% of the public says that they believe in God. And we also noticed that in the culture of biology, there could be kind of this condescension towards religion within the culture. And so we started studying instructors teaching evolution and asking them how they were addressing perceived conflict when they were teaching evolution. And when we interviewed instructors at secular institutions, most of them said that they were avoiding talking about religion and evolution completely. And there was a small subset of them that said that they were actively presenting evolution and religion as kind of adversaries to one another. And often when we asked them, like, why weren't they using some strategies that had already been published in the literature? So role models and some of these strategies that we've put under religious cultural competence had already been recommended by researchers, and they weren't using them because sometimes of this difference in religious culture and beliefs from their students. And then we interviewed students that were learning evolution, Judeo-Christian students who were learning evolution, and they confirmed what the instructor said. So they said that instructors generally were avoiding the topic of religion when teaching evolution. And what was new that we found, though, is that these students sometimes said that by avoiding the topic of religion, it actually solidified their ideas that evolution and religion had to be in conflict. So students come into our class with all of these preconceptions already about the conflict between religion and science. So when instructors were avoiding it, it was just kind of solidifying that conception for them. So then we got to thinking, well, what happens when there's not this disconnect in religious culture and belief between the instructor and the student? And so we interviewed Christian university evolution instructors. So these are instructors who are Christians themselves, and they're teaching evolution to Christian students. And we asked them the same questions that we asked the instructors at secular universities, and their answers were completely different. They were almost all of them, we interviewed 33, almost all of them were using these culturally competent strategies to help students reconcile their religious beliefs in evolution. And when we asked them why, they cited their own experiences as religious individuals and the struggle that they went through to reconcile these two areas of their lives and how they wanted to help students through that struggle. So all of these together really helped us solidify that we needed to start taking into account this difference between most secular scientists and the religious audiences that they're trying to communicate to and teach. And cultural competence is whether or not people from one culture can effectively communicate to people of another culture. So we thought that this framework could be useful.
Okay, great. Thank you. So it's interesting how someone's identity can be so impactful for how they interpret scientific concepts. And as you pointed out, evolution is not the only topic that this happens for, right? It can happen for COVID vaccines. It could happen for acceptance of climate change. I know you talked a little bit about how role models could help in these areas, but are there other ways you see that cultural competence could be really useful and relevant for reducing conflict with some of these other issues?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So essentially in these other areas, we have the same kind of baseline thing happening, right? So we have mostly scientists who are of one religious or political background, right? So we know that scientists and professors tend to be liberal and secular, right? Whereas the public has a wider variation of conservative and religious individuals. So we have this same kind of cultural difference between the scientists trying to communicate and the people that they're trying to communicate to when it comes to climate change and COVID-19. So what we can do is we can start to take this framework and this approach that, Sarah, you and I have started to take, where we try to identify where can we reduce the perceived conflict as a strategy for trying to decouple this relationship between identity and whether or not you accept like robust scientific concepts. So role models is one way that we can do that, right? So showing conservative examples of people who have concern for climate change or accepting of COVID-19, but also other things that we've talked about, like the nature of science and talking about how science can't really tell us like what we should do about some of these things, right? Like climate change. But the science can tell us what is happening and what will happen if we don't do anything about it. So I'm really excited to see how we can start to use this cultural competence framework for other topics across biology that are socially controversial, but like I said, are really robust scientific concepts that we have a lot of evidence for. But for some reason, a lot of complicated reasons, people's identities are weakening the relationship between their understanding and their acceptance of these topics.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. And it highlights just how potentially broad reaching this work could actually be. So the majority of your work that you talked about focuses on undergraduate biology education. And I want you to talk a little bit about why undergrad might be different than K through 12 and why studying undergrad perceptions of these scientific but controversial issues is particularly important.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we first started doing this research, a long time ago, there was already a lot of literature on K through 12 evolution education, and particularly looking at how teachers have stress about teaching evolution in a K through 12 setting, sometimes because they have religious beliefs and backgrounds that conflict with evolution, or because they're afraid of the backlash that they'll get from students and parents teaching evolution. This is a much different context than undergrad education, right? So at this level, you have PhD biologists teaching evolution. Most of them are secular, so they don't have a lot of concerns about like their own conflict with evolution. And they have a really high understanding, so they don't have stress about teaching it in an accurate way where they'll get backlash. So we thought that this unique context where we had that cultural disconnect was worth exploring because nobody had until that point. I mean, it was spot on for researchers to focus on K through 12 in the beginning, because this is the time that students are really forming their beliefs. And the earlier that we can teach evolution, the more better their outcomes will be in undergraduate education. But now we have to think about, where are these K through 12 teachers being developed as evolution educators, right? So theoretically, these biology teachers are taking college level biology classes. So when we're thinking about undergraduate education, we're thinking about even developing some of these teachers who are going to go and teach evolution in the K through 12 setting. And these teachers, who we've seen in the literature, say that they still struggle with a perceived conflict with their religion and evolution. Well, hopefully, by focusing more and doing some research at the undergraduate level, the instruction that they can get might be able to help if religious cultural competence is being implemented. And then they can learn. I mean, we teach how we're taught, right? I'm sure anybody who's taught before knows that they've gotten some of their strategies from their previous mentors in teaching, right? And that's no different from our K through 12 teachers. I think that they're going to see the way evolution is taught at the college level and hopefully adopt some of those practices of religious cultural competence if they're exposed to them. So that religious cultural competence kind of becomes a cycle between undergraduate education and K through 12 education.
Great. Well, thank you, Liz, for your thoughtful presentation and your really engaging answers to these questions. Just a reminder to everyone watching that this is just one of 3 spotlight videos focusing on the individual work of the speakers within this session, focused on that intersection between science and religion. In February, we will all come back together for a live panel specifically called Evidence for Reducing Conflict Between Science and Religion. And check out the AAAS annual meeting website for the panel's specific date and time. So thank you again to Liz as our speaker, and to you, the audience, and hopefully we'll see you live in February.